classically, the ego is actually just a rational organizing principle. It's not a bad thing, but we've relied so much, put so much emphasis on the ego that it's become a runaway system. So much of that is being able to bring the ego back in balance. We construct pretty much a bubble within ourselves that has a barrier of being able to connect with other people, connect with larger communities, and most certainly to connect with Earth, because we're so self-centered.
Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't.
I'm Kira Epstein. I'm the co-director of the new school at Commonweal. We are so honored to have Jeanine Canty here with us today as our second visiting scholar at the new school at Commonweal. I was introduced to Jeanine by our first visiting scholar, Craig Chalquist, and I'm so glad that Craig made that connection because over the last couple of months, I've got to know Jeanine just a little bit, and I'm just amazed at the work that she's been doing, the people that you're able to touch through your teaching and your writing. Jeanine is a professor at CIIS, the California Institute of Integral Studies, and teaches also at Pacifica Graduate Institute and Naropa Institute in Colorado. For those of you that don't know us, the new school is Commonweal's learning community and podcast. For the last almost 20 years, we have been hosting conversations and lectures and workshops and music concerts and art gallery exhibits. We work around the topics that Commonweal champions, which are finding meaning, growing resilience, advocating for justice, and stewarding the natural world. So this is a great fit to have Jeanine here. Jeanine Canty, welcome to the new school at Commonweal.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming, and also the people that are online. It's such an honor to be here. Yesterday, or even the last few days, as I was preparing to travel from Boulder, I was, checking off my list of things to bring and all that kind of stuff. And then at some point I got so excited that I was coming to a place that's dedicated to the healing of people and Earth. And so I said, oh, everyone here is here because that is their mission as well. And so I said, oh, I think I may have found another widening circle, but of my people. Yeah, so it's such an honor. Just coming to this land, this place is so amazing, and I just feel so blessed to be here. So the theme of my time here is around mind and spirit, which when I received the invitation, I said, oh, that's perfect. I've been working on some current writing that weaves these together and really looking at both our dual mind, our separation from nature, all of those polarities, but also how do we reclaim and integrate to be in tune to not only land, larger earth, human community, and also more of our, I would say, our re-enchantment, our transpersonal selves. And so I get really excited about all of those pieces. So before I jump into things, I actually wanted to start us off with a short meditation. Wherever you are, feel your feet on the earth and your sit bones on your chair or your cushion, or if you're at home standing, just feel that rootedness of your feet. And let your body be heavy and supported by the ground below you, your chair. And then get in touch with your breath deep in your belly. So this is a good time to let go of any six-pack abs and to let your belly burgeon like a Buddha a bit. Deep inhales that go all the way up your torso to your crown, and deep exhales that go all the way back down. And then imagine that you've got roots that plunge from your sit bones, and they plunge deep into the earth below us. And it doesn't matter if you are many stories above, they will plunge through any form of concrete or barriers and find rich earth below and spread widely. And I like this year, particularly imagining that I've got roots that go 18 feet down, really both grounding and connecting us. And as you're breathing, just notice your torso and be sure to sit upright, but not too controlled. Perhaps shrug up your shoulders a little bit. Let your neck be long, slightly tuck your chin, stretch out your face a little bit. And then I like to also imagine that I've got branches that sprout out of the crown of my head and reach up to the skies above us widely, mirroring those roots below. And you might just do a glean of your body and notice any spaces of tension, and bringing a deep breath to all of those spaces. And you might just notice how you feel right now, letting just one emotion surface for you without much thought. And honoring, thanking that emotion, knowing that it's going to shift. And then, since we'll be talking about ego and mind and separation, one thing I like to do in my meditations is to acknowledge my ego and just tell my ego, oh, I am so sorry for overusing you for all of my life. Thank you for all you've done for me. And I like to imagine that I am a trunk. The trunk of my body has like a little hollow opening, and that I can just open up a little door. And inside is a beautiful nest that some critter might just enter into. And it's well lit but warm. And I say, hello, ego, come into my little nest and rest here. And my ego really likes this space, and I close the door of the trunk, but leave it enough air. And I invite you to do the same. And we'll just sit for a moment. Okay. Well, thanks for participating in a little sitting. Thank you to all of our egos for taking a little break. I'm going to turn mine on just a little bit for the talk part. So yeah, the title of this talk is Reclaiming Wildness, Integrating Self Through Practice. And I'll go through framing all sorts of things and then keep shifting. And for this first part, I just want to just remind us, I don't think any of us in this room or probably online are not aware that we are living in a time where we have these interlinking crises that are paramount. And so we've got the ecological and social, we've got spiritual. Many people use the term polycrises or polycrisis. David Corton and Joanna Macy both use the term the Great Unraveling, where we're seeing all of these systems really no longer working. And many of us who are in those worlds have been seeing this for decades. We've seen it get worse and worse. So it's not necessarily a surprise, but we're really in it, in like the spin cycle of all of the messiness, all of the suffering. So there's, for so many of us, no denial of it. And then there's lots of opportunity for denial in other spaces, which is something to obviously be working with. And so with all of this, with the spinning out of control, even if some of the current things that are going on, even reverted back to a year ago or 5 years ago. We said, oh, it's, it's a little easier, a little less explosive. Probably a lot of us would also be aware that we've been living in quite a flat land in terms of a materialistic reality that doesn't feel necessarily alive or meaningful or spiritual or engaging and relational, and that we'd still be feeling an absence of something going on. So, the disruptions of our time, while they're so awful in so many ways, they're also disrupting a status quo that many of us are just so eager and ready to let go of and invoke something new. And as people of Western civilization, and I always frame Western civilization as well as people living under a corporate globalized reality, we adhere to what Joanna Macy and others would say, we're living this double life. We maybe have all of these inklings to go in different directions, yet we're being supported in so many ways by the materialistic reality that we live under. And so we have these levels of comfort and for some of us, a lot of ease, yet we see that we want to go away from these forms. We're also living so many different forms of duality when we go with spaces of mind and looking at how we have such a hard time navigating the nowness, the present, that so many people in our society are always in an abstract thinking, a distance, paying attention to that small or sometimes very loud voice in our heads and having trouble actually relating to the here and now. And that might not just be in our heads, it might be on our devices or so many different spaces that being here is really hard. We've got so many dualities that disrupt our personal, our collective, our planetary well-being from self and nature. And we'll get into this a little bit with ecopsychology and framing that, but how we've really distanced our relationship with the natural world, so much so that we often forget that we're actually animals. So yeah, right? We also have these dualities, mind and spirit. So many of us have kind of lost the awness of being alive as sentient beings in the world and just the mysteriousness and the magical reality of that, and instead prefer to have a controlled, maybe linear, rationalistic perspective, or to be kind of stuck into sorts of bubbles and devices rather than just getting out and looking up and looking within all around. Globally, we have so much division between self and other. Thinking of Martin Buber and the I and thou, we have so much I and other, I and not me. So we have such strong divides in our society. And so we have so many different forms of division. I really subscribe to so much within the areas of depth psychology, ecopsychology, Buddhism. I always call myself Buddhish. I never want to be fully into anything. So I'm always a little ish, yeah. But those three areas ask something much deeper of us. And so I'll do a little framing with these depth psychology and really looking at kind of the spiritual and psyche. And depth psychology, similar to, I teach a bit in the field of deep ecology, and I love how deep ecology says it's deep because it doesn't want to use shallow measures to address the ecological crisis. And I don't think depth psychology necessarily said this in its literature to parallel that, but depth psychology says we're not going to use just like behavioralism or individual, your individual relationship with your primary caregiver, although that's very important. But we're going to go deeper and wider and through many actually planes and realities. And so really saying that the mere material, rational, linear, status quo prescriptions do not work. And often the terms depth psychology and transpersonal psychology are used interchangeably. For years, I always related with transpersonal psychology more. And then as I started kind of peeling the onion of depth psychology, I got more, I guess, entranced with it, because depth psychology is really asking us to work with issues of soul. And what does that mean? And so soul and psyche. And in a lot of ways, depth psychology is asking us to restore an ancient worldview, an ancient earth-based consciousness view, where we're bridging and living in the divine realms of the unseen world, and bringing this into our current human life journey, which, that sounds intriguing. Count me in. And the field of depth psychology, particularly within the Jungian camps, draws most directly from Greek mythology as a way of personifying the larger psyche of the world, and the kind of Greek and the Roman myths, and just this interaction with our human consciousness. And so it's a very Western tradition, but it has so many parallels with indigenous traditions and earth-based cosmologies and stories. But I find it very fascinating, and particularly because we're talking about mind and spirit and divides, that depth psychology being so situated in Greek myths and Western consciousness, that those mythologies are actually telling the narrative of the time where this split was happening. So it's kind of like, oh, okay. Like, it's actually transcribing the stories of this time, of this brokenness, of this wound, of this straddling these different worlds. So like, really fascinating. And we'll get back a little bit to depth psychology, and I'll talk. My passion is eco-psychology. I won't even say I'm eco-psychology-ish. I'm all about eco-psychology, and I just love this field. And it's bringing together earth, psyche, and the spiritual. And eco-psychology is really saying that the state of the earth and the state of our psyches are totally connected, and that when humans really separated from earth, we cause both the ecological crisis and also our collective psychopathology. And so I work under the assumption that there's 4 key assumptions in eco-psychology. And the first is that the earth is calling for healing. And, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand that there's so many climate change disasters going on in our society that we're seeing. I won't even paint out, because we know this. You probably wouldn't be attending this if you weren't aware that we're in a major ecological crisis that's global. And the second assumption of eco-psychology is that people are calling for healing. And you also don't need to be a rocket science or a psychologist to notice that. We see so much mass suffering, whether it's through poverty, people being unhoused. We have so much warfare and divisions. And then even just from like a more low-level plane, we have so many folks that are struggling with addictions, whether it's through drugs and alcohol, opioids, codependent relationships, as well as techno addictions, always being on the phone, always being in front of the TV, always working all the time in front of the computer. And also there's, the most popular is probably consumerism, which our society really excels at in terms of purchasing things and always having to have like the bigger, best, more. If I'm not feeling well, I can just, buy something and maybe that will perk me up for that 3-minute purchase. So really looking at the pathologies of that. And we have definitely a youth crisis with so many young people, lives, death by suicide. We have mass shootings. The list goes on and on, where we live in a society where almost everyone who can afford so sees a therapist, and so many folks that don't have access to these things, yet it's so individualized and personalized, rather looking at the collective issues. And so then the third assumption of ecopsychology is that the calling for healing of people and the calling for healing of the planet are totally interconnected phenomenon. They're not separate. It's all about the same issue. And the fourth assumption, which I've already named, is that the sickness is embedded in the history and culture of Western civilization, and again, expanding that to include anyone living under a global corporatized reality, which unfortunately is most people in the world. Even if you're in the most remote area, you're not separate from these phenomenon. I always like to remind when I start breaking down the problems to remember we were breathing, naming emotions, being in our bodies, because often he was like, oh, I'm getting tense, and oh, I just bought something, and oh, yeah, so just let that, we want to let information come in, but we don't want to also activate our defense mechanisms where we're simultaneously trying to push it out. So, okay, we can let that in and be in a space to take in some more and be in relationship and feel our bodies. Yeah, and so with ecopsychology, well, I always have to mention one of my favorite writers, the psychotherapist Chellis Glendenning. She's got this book, My Name is Chellis and I'm in Recovery from Western Civilization. And she writes about the original trauma, that point of like, what happened in Western civilization where we broke our paradigms away from Earth. And so she talks about it as domestication, when folks stopped being, thought they were no longer dependent on the cycles and seasons and started mass producing food and staying in one place, and populations increased. And so there's so much there to unpack. And other eco-psychologists will talk about the, everyone blames Descartes and mechanistic linear science. We also have definitely the abstract mind and the written word, where we're no longer in relationship with land through language. We could actually separate, and we don't even need to go outside to be in conversation with any being. There's so many things, definitely colonization's a huge one. As our populations got bigger and needing more and more space, so spreading out over the world to take resources and take the land of other peoples. And in all that process too, the separation of gender roles. And so there's so much more with that. A lot of people will talk about formalized religion having a hand in it, in terms of suddenly, instead of having a direct connection with what is sacred and what is the divine, you become, as Krishnamurti would say, a second-hand being, where it's your intermediary between what you would be considered sacred comes through a pulpit or a book or a specific person. And so many people now have suitcase religions where you can carry them wherever you go, instead of being in deep relationship with the land, where the most sacred forms of spirituality arise, and where it's such a personal and collective relationship that we all have connection to. So I think it's also interesting to bring ecopsychology together with depth psychology, and particularly with Carl Jung's work. Probably a lot of people are familiar with the term the collective unconscious, and Kira mentioned I teach at CIIS in the transformative learning PhD program, transformative studies, and so I get really into transformative learning and worldviews and how we use so many defense mechanisms to not see things in that whole process of consciousness. And I have to admit that for years in ecopsychology, studying it, I'd come across, the term the collective unconsciousness, but I, for years, called it the collective consciousness, because nature is aware, like the universe is aware, the transpersonal is aware. The only ones kind of not on board with awareness are humans of Western paradigms. And so it wasn't until I was going deeper into depth psychology that I realized I had to go back to some of the writings of Theodore Roszak, and I was like, oh yeah, he was saying the collective unconscious. I just blocked that out. And so the collective unconscious is really looking at how the Western mind has a repository in the kind of unseen, the shadow, the inaccessible aspects of the transpersonal world, because we have repressed so much stuff with our relationship with nature and psyche. And Jung wrote so much about this, and in his work was very connected to nature, especially towards the end of his life. And some folks might be familiar with, he would talk about the 2 million year old man and really, person, but that all of this content, which was so much about vitality, life, the sensual, the sexual, the artistic, the creative, the imaginal, had kind of gotten pulled out of our stories and left into this collective unconscious. And so much of the work of this was to unpack it. Yet, to his detriment, Jung also made it very human-centric. So a lot of Jungian today, not everyone, it's changed so much in the last decade or two, but will make the collective conscious particularly just a human phenomenon, and not necessarily tapping it into the widest forms. So that's really important. And but both Jung and ecopsychology really hone in on this split, this divide in our psyches and our consciousness. And the ecopsychology kind of theorist Paul Shepard said, we have been ideological deflowered, we've been demyth, and this was set in motion again by the ancient Greeks, and that it's all of this is so overwhelming. And he also really pulled, as do Jungians, the archetypal imagery that's really representing like our past. I always love, if I do watch television or a movie once in a while, and you turn on like the Viking stories, and it's like the old gods and the new gods, and so but that's where where we've lost kind of like the old stories in so many ways, yet we haven't really stepped into the new stories because we're in this, still in the story of stuff or rational consciousness. And so the work of our times is to re-enchant the world and to, work with all of this. As all of our old stories, this knowledge has been erased. We see this so much in terms of, in some ways, the colonization of the world, particularly with indigenous peoples. Yet those stories are so intact and flourishing. There's the term, we're still here for so many groups, that indigenous peoples are actually holding so much content of this, and that's actually the invitation for people that are subsumed in Western civilization to get on board with reanimating our own stories and to entering the conversation, not with our abstract minds, but in a way that we're starting to listen, learn, participate. Buddhists will often say, see if I remember, that you hear, and then maybe you'll actually, you listen first. And then maybe if you get that down, you'll start hearing. And then if you really work with that, maybe you'll start understanding. And you're like, what? That's a lot of work, but so important. And so a lot of depth psychologists and others will really say that when we have this collective unconscious where everything's, repressed, not seen, inaccessible, all of those things are actually breaking out in other ways. And so with our godliness, our sacred selves split, we have things that people would say are demons or psychoses, complexes, because we're no longer integrated with our instinctual earth-based psyches, our bodies, our creativity, our femininity, our ecological selves, our animal selves. And so, that gets into, oh gosh, that's really interesting. And it is really interesting. And we can kind of see, and again, like our mainstream television and movies, and you turn on the news, or, that we see these things actually manifesting. And then when we look at the kind of terrors that we're seeing in our, the collective suffering that's happening on the planet, you see that they're bubbling up. And we wouldn't necessarily say, well, it's because we've, desouled our world and the soul is trying to burst back in. But in a lot of ways, that's what we say. Another theorist I love, Sharif Abdullah, calls our kind of time we're the breakers, because we've broke with our earth-based traditions. And he calls the indigenous peoples of all time the keepers. And we'll get into what are called the menders, because I love that term. And that's like who we are or are becoming. And so the problem, it's not simply that abstract thinking, mind, and ego are bad. It's because those things are actually gifts, of course, and they have a role to play. But as a lot of ecopsychologists, particularly, again, I think Paul Shepard talks about, we're in arrested development, where people within a Western paradigm, we've never matured because we didn't have this older way of being in relationship to the earth. And so pretty much all of our leaders, our stars, ourselves, we're at the maturity level of like teenagers or preteens as a collective, that we've not, and not necessarily, you all seem very developed and actualized and collective, but the general population, including me. So just acknowledging that. And so, the work of our time is so much about integrating our earth-based transpersonal natures with this abstract thinking mind and this consciousness. And so, which is a great project in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, one of my favorite things is I liked calling it selving. And I was telling someone recently, I really like that term because it rhymes with elving. Yeah, right. And we all should be elving. And Kira mentioned that the second event we'll do while I'm here is a conversation with Susan Newsom, and we'll talk more about these selves, but I wanted to just give a little background on that because they're important concepts and there's so much about practice. And the second event on October 23rd will get into some practice with us. And so first, again, ego, we started off with meditation around ego, and we also call it egocentricity in terms of we are so centered on our bound, separate self. And so within Buddhism, we so much about the illusion of self, the illusion of ego, and that all of our suffering is usually has to do with like an ego. It's an ego problem. So we work so much with not being so attached to our identities and experiences. And ego, it is problematic because it creates this division, this dualistic view in terms of always being in abstract thinking, always being having this narration of this separate mind that is often just constantly critiquing what you're doing wrong, what that person's doing wrong, what this society is doing wrong, that we can just follow that narrative all the time instead of, I'm in that again. But I know there's lots of therapists, therapeutic psychology folks here and online, and we know that classically, the ego is actually just a rational organizing principle. It's not a bad thing, but we've relied so much, put so much emphasis on the ego that it's become a runaway system. And so much of that is being able to bring the ego back in balance. And with the overblown ego, we claim such a false identity. And so we do it in such a way, and Kira mentioned my book, Returning the Self to Nature, which gets all into this, but we construct pretty much a bubble within ourselves that has a barrier of being able to connect with other people, connect with larger communities, and most certainly to connect with Earth because we're so self-centered. And our larger systems, particularly the corporations, our governments, media, really find it very helpful to have us addicted to ourselves because we are constantly thinking about all of the things that we need to fuel ourselves, which usually contribute to increasing our GDP and their profit, and also our compliance to larger systems. So having a overly insecure, overly blown ego is quite profitable for others. So the cycles continue and continue. And then in more of the Dharma communities, Buddhist communities, the work of ego is noticing that we have one, because we can, again, be in that bubble. So many of us are in that bubble and don't even realize that this is a problem because this is just the norm. This is what we do. But when we start to actually be like, oh, I don't have to be like this all the time. There are other ways to be. There's the work of starting to befriend our egos, which is actually really quite challenging. And when we work with that, then the work becomes opening up to larger realities. And I mean, it could just be the larger reality of like the space. When I work with a lot of my students with meditation or different things, saying, well, the project that you're doing it well if you can actually be bored, because you're so present with just right now. If you're constantly entertaining yourself with other thoughts or other spaces, other storylines, you're not actually here. And maybe you're right here and it's delightful, but often it's pretty boring, which like that is lovely. Right? Yeah. I remember as a young person just like being so upset if I was like bored and didn't have anything to do. And now I'm like, gosh, I wish I could be bored. And I can be, yeah. And then opening to something greater, other experiences, and that's like a whole world. And ecopsychology most certainly asks us to open to something greater, and that, of course, is nature and all living systems and all sentient beings. Yeah, we'll talk about this at the next event. So we've got the ego. And then when we move it into a bit of ecopsychology and deep ecology, it's all about the ecological self, which I love that concept. And this is actually where a lot of the healing comes in as well. Because with the ecological self, it's our beginning, our kind of first shattering of the small ego bubble and stepping into another reality. And this term was coined by the deep ecologist Arne Næss, the Norwegian, and then also the beloved and late Joanna Macy often called it the greening of the self. And Arne Næss also called it self-realization, because it's learning to make yourself bigger and bigger, not bigger that way, but wide, Joanna Macy would always say widening circles. And so the ecological self starts first where we maybe have one relationship with one being. Maybe it's the spider in the corner in your bathroom that instead of, sweeping up and throwing away, you carefully bring outside, or maybe even become roommates, permanent roommates, or it's the bird in the yard when you're outside that you start chirping with, and then suddenly you're having a little conversation where you might not know what is being said, but there's some sort of affection happening. And when we start doing this with particular bodies of water, or maybe a tree, our whole bioregions, suddenly we realize that our wellness and the wellness of others is bound up with one another. And we realize that not only is there some sort of what ecopsychologists would call biophilia, I think E.O. Wilson and Keller term that, where there's love between, but we also realize that our identities start changing, where we're no longer so fixated on our individual stories, but we're so curious about others. And then with the ecological self, we also move into what one of my dearest mentors, Carl Anthony, calls the multicultural self. And Arne Næss also would talk about the social self. And Carl Anthony in particular, he's very famous for naming that we don't learn the stories of the multicultural people in our communities. He grew up in Philadelphia, and in social studies, it was always like the Pilgrims. And I remember, like, why do we have so much social studies? And we always start from the same place. And he said, why don't we learn about like the Polish people and the Italians and then the Black people? And so this is really learning about the stories of the people within our communities and realizing like everyone has unique paths and histories and identities, and they make us so much of a collective. But if we never hear these stories, we actually really lower our ability for compassion. And I've been really into the work of John Powell this year. He has a new book that came out last year around bridging, and it builds on the work of Grant Putnam with the book Bowling Alone and others, of really that if we only stay within the narratives of folks that make us comfortable or within our own stories, we have hard breaks. We no longer have the ability to stretch across various communities to work around these really big issues. And right now in our, especially in our society, bridging and, multicultural stories, it's like, yet it's so important if we're actually going to be a democracy and to be in community and connect with one another, to know the stories and have the ability to sit with different identities, different worldviews, different political beliefs, different religious beliefs, in a way that we're not triggered because someone's different than us. Instead, we should be actually curious. And that's what the multicultural self is, that maybe we just have a friend who's a different political belief or religion or gender identity or race, and we learn about them and we're like, that's interesting, and like we're neighbors, and suddenly, again, just like with that bird, we're realizing that there's these points of connection and some love forming between us, and so not only do we have more compassion for them, we realize that we've been fundamentally changed with that realization and those actions. So again, we get larger. And then we can take the kind of the ecological self and the multicultural self and the field of transpersonal and depth psychology, talk about the self with a capital S, which is also known as the transpersonal self. And that's where not only are we connecting with other sentient beings, but we're starting to connect with what some may call, the spiritual worlds or the magical worlds, or kind of the unknown world, in a way that we start to really tap into the greater awe of life and kind of the mystery. And we might have a sense of being in relationships to places and stories and landscapes and wisdom that comes from us to us in a way that we've never really experienced before. Maybe we did and we lost that. And so again, we're getting much wider and bigger. And again, we start noticing that we've changed. And in the work I do with transformative learning, there's something called the self-transforming self. And this is really the idea that we will, the healthy person is one. I like to say we're never going to be a fully baked cookie. Like, we're never done. And so we're always being able to work with our critical self-reflection of our held assumptions and worldview, and taking in new phenomena, not just through reading books or documentaries, but through being able to reflect and engage in deep experiences, that we're constantly getting into this space where we're constantly changing who we are, which is actually incredibly threatening to someone who's in a kind of flatland or fixed perspective. And it's a really deep skill to start learning how to navigate this. The last area that I want to get into is the task of our times that we were talking about in terms of these bridgers, menders of straddling the old gods and the new gods, or whatever we may call it, in terms of our divisions of mind and self, nature and self. And so when we're in this, bringing back some of our nature-based, earth-based realities into the current consciousness that's very ego-led, abstract thinking, which isn't fully bad at all, and bringing those back together. There's one theorist that I really gravitate to is Jerome Bernstein. Has this, he's a depth psychologist, and he talks about borderland consciousness. And he's saying that it wasn't until quite recently that humanity, and particularly people within Western civilization, were actually ready to bridge these two consciousness together and to actually create something new from that. We were still working so much with our development of our conscious egos, of our Western consciousness, the abstract thinking, that finally we're in a place where we're ready to merge and to create something different. And I feel really strongly that it's not about, and others too, I'm not the only person saying this, that we're not like trying to go back to our original earth-based traditions, because we have this other thing that's arisen that we need to work with and bring to the present and the future. And so there's so many folks. Like, then it gets back to what I was talking about with John Powell with this term bridgers, and he's talking more about the current political and social issues, but there's also just this bridging of these two psyches and consciousness and how we bring them into the current to create something new. Sharif Abdullah, who I mentioned before, this idea of menders, another way of saying it. And then just recently, I was exposed to the work, and I was speaking to some folks about this, of Owen Barfield. I don't know if anyone's heard of him. Yeah, just fascinating. Read some Owen Barfield. I'm reading a lot of him right now, but he's got this interesting term that reminds me so much of Jerome Bernstein's concept of borderland consciousness, but he talks about final participation, and he is more of a theosophist and also a Christian, and really names original participation was more of our earth-based consciousness, and we're moving to what is final participation. And it's not the end of the world and our final role in it. It means of actually, again, dropping into this more poetic imagination and creativity. So bringing the old gods into the current reality. And so this comes in a lot of other work too. We could name Jean Gebster's four-dimensional integral structure. I think a lot about Rudolf Steiner's work with being fifth dimensional beings. And there's so many different ways that this is named, but it's so much about not just so many of the folks that write about these things could be labeled to some extent more armchair academics. And so much of this work is about actually the real participation with nature, with our bodies, with the transpersonal world, with the dream world, with community, with service. So I get so excited about the practice of all of this. Yeah, why don't we stop there? Because now we have ample time for Q&A.
The talk was about wildness and then the bridging of the healing. And so I'm curious then how all these different, I mean, I know Steiner's work and because my kid went to a Waldorf school, but just how you bridge this work of these people into healing.
Yeah. And a lot of that will also come in when we start doing some practices next week. But what I named a little bit in terms of that ecological self, the multicultural self, the transpersonal self. So much about this is doing actual practices that have access to these. In my book, Returning the Self to Nature, I give a lot of different areas to work with. Definitely the ecological self is in there. Most certainly, I really feel so strongly about meditation and other contemplative practices, including somatic practices that are just like simple things of being able to. It's interesting because there's a little duality with meditation, especially maybe Buddhist classic traditions, where sometimes you're inside or even in a dark space in some forms with your eyes closed, so you're like shutting out. But I'm a full supporter of meditating with nature, outside, eyes open, not staring. So we're starting to, the goal is not to shut everything out, but to quell our minds and actually to start, again, listening, hearing, understanding, and really being. There's also a huge piece that I find in this work is actually becoming emotional again in our kind of Western paradigm. And this is one of the reasons ecopsychology often critiques the field of psychology in general, is that it makes everything so individualistic. And so in our society, often emotions need to be privatized too. So like if you're feeling bad, you need to wait till you get into your bedroom, and then maybe you can have a short cry, but don't tell anyone about it. If you're, at work, you better not, bring your emotional state into it and just, give your report. And, things change. And, I know Californians, it's different, but actually being able to inhabit our bodies fully and inhabit the full spectrum of our emotions, really the difficult emotions. And I know the work of, again, Joanna Macy, Pema Chodron, Miriam Greenspan, there's so many folks that have guidance with us of actually being able to work with what might be called, dark emotions, or really the difficult or unpopular emotions. And when we actually are able to experience those really deep lows and the full-on, full-blown emotions, we actually have an acuity to have big emotions, like heavy, but also bigger joys, and to experience like the full spectrum color of the world. I spend a lot of time with folks that are working around social justice issues and ecological justice issues, and so funny, so endearing, and able to like attend to like these really difficult witnessing of collective suffering. Another area that I find really important, and particularly with my work with narcissism, but any paradigm, is that there's so many people in our society that don't open to something bigger. And particularly with narcissism, that collective paradigm, that an individual narcissist has to control the world and really order like what the narrative and what the story is. But when we can let go and learn to let go a little bit more, and to rest our egos a bit and allow the real, the larger stories that are coming up, that's where we have the ability to open to what may be called grace, or whatever your God may be, or your spirit, or the divine, or I even see like the matrix, whatever, the force, but that we actually realize that there's something underscoring all reality that's much bigger than the human dimension. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
I loved how gently you had us hold our egos at the beginning. I thought that was beautiful. I've always, for me, that the quiet sitting on a cushion meditating is impossible because, and also this idea that somehow I'm to get rid of the ego when I have this chattering brain. But a meditation that is participating in a conversation and deeply listening to nature takes me out of myself and my ego and attunes me to the natural world. So that's one of the ways that for me, meditation and nature just go hand in hand because I'm just in a place of deep listening to other than my human consciousness. But one of the things I'm curious about, just because it's up and everywhere, is you talked a little bit about technology and entrancement. So where are we headed with AI and this whole feeling of this deep need to connect to the natural world, but how virtual reality and is becoming so incredibly, and talk about the collective unconscious, you know, I mean, AI collects everything, you know, I mean, what is it even more in a AI world? So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about that. I know it's a huge question.
It's a huge question, and you know, and as an academic, in our faculty roles, it's just the biggest topic because you know, students are using AI, and AI is filtering into everything, and in research, and you know, a lot of academics just want to be no, and I can be a Luddite in that way. And I actually, a few years ago, I always have these synchronistic experiences, but it came to me, I had heard of this author, his name's Greg Braden, he's in Santa Fe, and he's got mixed reviews, but really his main kind of thesis statement is that AI is not necessarily like the worst thing in the world, but the real danger is that so many of us haven't even tapped into our transpersonal realities and our creative skills, that if we just jump into this AI world, we're letting all of that go because we're kind of plugging up all of our capacities to plug into a greater reality. And so really, in some ways, I think there has to be some training of AI to orient to the transpersonal, at least. AI is here and technology is here. I definitely prescribe more to, I'm the type of person that every time I do a computer update, I have to uncouple all of the AI devices and that kind of thing. But then I was telling someone recently, just the other day, I watched K-pop Demon Hunters. Has anyone seen that? Right? It was so good. Not only the dance, but right? Yes, exactly. We've got some dancing going on, right? Yeah, but bringing the capacity of a techno story to bring kind of the transpersonal kind of futurism into like the youth. So in some ways, it's the ways that we use the tool. But I'm also the person that whenever there's like an AI subcommittee or training or meeting, I tend not to go because I just get upset about it. So I have to be honest.
There's an Ashley who is wondering if there's one actionable piece that would contribute to reclaiming our wildness that people could take away with themselves, for themselves today.
Oh, one piece, yeah. I mean, I would say probably the most important, well, they're all important, but one would just be to focus on our ecological selves and becoming wild. Because so many of us, we dress up and put on shoes and read books and get into our cars, right? Yes, but we forget that we're animals. And if we go back to that piece with telesclenating, recognizing that we're so domesticated and we're so authored by society's expectations. So if we can all get a little, I guess there's a saying, go feral. So just getting a little wild to notice that our bodies were animalistic beings and starting to have contact with other beings, not just other humans, but other beings in nature, and starting there and really doing the attending to and listening and understanding.
I want to go back to the great unraveling and the polycrisis. So much of our work here is in that area. And often when the subject comes up, the reaction is, well, I mean, there's multiple reactions. Common one is to change the subject. Another one is despair. And sometimes as a conversation continues, it follows into this almost tribal worldview. It's like protect your own, protect your family, protect yourselves. And as you were talking about kind of ecopsychology, I'm just imagining, are there ways or kind of your reflections, and how can you facilitate like a session or a conversation to reconnect with Earth and realize that there are pathways that come from that connection?
Yeah, thank you. That's such a great question. So much of the way I approach working with people and teaching is all about kind of the ecological and the social. And early in my career, I was teaching multicultural education. And right around the same time, I stumbled into ecopsychology. And so, and then around transformative learning, which is all about how adults work with their worldviews to expand them. And it's so easy when we're confronted with issues of social injustice, particularly racism, but any ism, to shut down. And same thing when we're working with realities around the ecological crisis, like, oh, statistics, whoa, how long, what, to just shut down. And so I really wanted to know what's the process between expansion. And so transformative learning is all about saying that we can just work on people's just past their comfort zone, so their edge of efficacy. And early in my career, I came across actually the list in Joanna Macy and Molly Young Brown in their book, Coming Back to Life. They have this list of why people don't engage with the ecological crisis, and then a list of the consequences why. And the first list, it was things like not wanting to appear too morbid, not wanting to be unpatriotic, not wanting to not be smart about it. In our Western view, we're supposed to, from A to Z, know all the points and be able to debate and defend. And I don't know, but this is a thing. And so there's a whole list, and then the consequences of that is all of these reasons why we suddenly then become apathetic, we don't vote, we become pretty morbid, or we get into places of helplessness or burnout. And so I, at the same time, started working with a colleague, turned me on to Milton Bennett's developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. And this goes through the cycles that people engage, particularly when they're working with some sort of difference like race. And it goes from denial, defense, minimization, at some point acceptance, and then adaptation and integration. And we can be in like one space with like racism, maybe we're in like minimization, but then with ecological issues. So I started pairing this list from Joanna Macy and Molly Young Brown with Milton Bennett's framework and transformative learning to start working around people's pliabilities with their worldviews. And I found that pairing ecological and social issues actually was a way to unguard people, because usually people have like a stake in one of them, and so they're able to gauge the other more easily if they're put together. And often it was also realizing that any issue of large scale racism, any pattern of that is pretty much always about the acquisition of natural resources. So it broke the paradigm that like, oh, people are racist because they're bad, or it's blah, blah, this, but it's actually about a system of acquisition. And so I try to really work dancing right on those edges. And what's interesting is it's not the same for each individual. So trying to tailor that to whatever group I'm engaging with, or if it's a one-on-one conversation. And for me, like the biggest learning edge with that is to recognize that I need to have respect and understanding of who I'm working with, and not to think that I hold all the answers. So how do I actually unlearn some of my assumptions and stay present? And again, listen, maybe hear, maybe understand, so there's actual a relationship happening instead of trying to just try to change someone.
When you were talking about people and animals and the connection, you know, with Jane Goodall just passing, there's some really beautiful films, documentaries and interviews with her about her relationship with chimps and monkeys and people and living in Africa and bringing her children there to live in these communities with. So I think that that's a really profound for me to watch her and listen to her. And she was so comfortable in who she was, and understanding of what of the world in that way.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really nice when you talk about the animals. Yeah.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah. Yeah. And remembering, thanks for invoking Jane Goodall. And yeah, we can invoke Joanna Macy as well, and Susan Griffin. Yeah.
Great. Thank you all for joining us. We will see you hopefully back next Thursday. Join us on Zoom or downstairs in the library. Thanks, everybody on Zoom.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much.
Don't take it, 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 don't take it,
The river is a healer, the river is a sage. The river knows no end, and the river feels no way.